Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for remaining for this second event, or second section of our event this morning. I thought that was just a really fascinating conversation between Tino and Jake Sullivan. We've got a fantastic panel here. I'm just going to introduce our moderator, my colleague, Matt Duss, who is a visiting researcher here at Carnegie with us. We're delighted to have him. He's just joined us a couple of months ago, coming out of being Senator Sanders' foreign policy advisor for the last several years. Prior to that, he has deep experience as an analyst of international affairs, especially on the Middle East, but also a range of other issues. So, Matt, thanks so much for heading this up for us.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for the conversation, and thanks to the panelists who have conveniently arranged themselves right as I have them listed here. But I also, before we get going, I do want to thank all of our staff for their amazing work setting up this event today, our junior fellows, and especially our project administrator, Ilyasa Queen Bailey. So could we please give them a round of applause? So we heard a pretty rich discussion led by our president, Tino Cuellar, with Jake Sullivan just a few moments ago. So I want to pick up on some of what was raised there. But first, I just want to thank again and introduce our panelists. Down at the end, we have Corey Shockey, a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, next to Corey, we have Rana Foroohar, who is a global business columnist and an associate editor at the Financial Times, and also CNN's global economic analyst. The author of a number of books, most recently Homecoming: The Path to Prosperity in a Post-Global World, which was published in October. Then we have Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment, where he oversees research in Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi on East Asia and South Asia. And to my right, we have Andrew Weiss, the James Family Chair and Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment, where he oversees research on Russia and Eurasia. And I do want to mention he has just published a graphic novel biography of Vladimir Putin, awesome. Accidental Tsar, The Life and Lives of Vladimir Putin. And I'm not just saying that because he's sitting right next to me, but as a fan of the graphic novel form, I really want to say this is a tremendous book. It really belongs, I think, in the kind of the top rank of some of these great books like Persepolis and Mouse. So I would highly recommend picking it up.
Wow, thank you.
So, let's, we have so many places we could start. Maybe if I could just start with you, Rana. I have not warned Rana that I was going to start with her, but I think it was interesting to me that we had a conversation with the National Security Advisor, and yet fully half, if not more, of that conversation was taken up with economics and trade.
Yeah.
And I think that reflects, not just the kind of theoretical underpinning of the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy, but I think a growing consensus around how we need to break down these barriers between domestic and economic and foreign policy as they have been previously understood.
Yeah.
So I think you've done a lot of writing about the kind of rethink of the global economic order. Your new book takes a look at what comes after neoliberalism. I'm thinking back to the piece that Jake himself wrote. I think it was around late 2018, maybe 2019 in Foreign Policy, basically proclaiming, yes, the end of neoliberalism. So it's going to be a bumpy road, but I'll just, one thing I'll just say personally is, my kind of entree into activism, into politics was in the kind of global justice movement of the late 90s and early 2000s. And in April 2000, I was actually leading a street team about a half mile from here during the protests against the IMF and World Bank. So it was pretty amazing for me to hear the National Security Advisor of the United States 22 years later saying, we need to get away from this idea of just making the world safe for corporate investment. So
I loved that quote.
Change takes a while, but it does come. So what do you think? Well,
I think we're at a 50-year pivot point, actually. That's what my new book is all about. I'll kind of back up for a minute and say that I'm coming at this debate from a journalistic perspective. So I spend about half my time talking to people like Jake and you all here, and about half of it out literally in the fields or in the field, talking to farmers, talking to small business owners, looking at what is actually happening on the ground to real people. And to me, there has always been a huge divide which needed to be bridged between foreign policy, national security, and domestic policy and domestic economic interests, which are just naturally aligned. I mean, and they need to be. I'll just give you one anecdote that I think, I mean, it was one of the reasons I wrote my book, and I think expresses the felt experience that we need to be dealing with. I wanted to understand some of the decisions of the 1990s trade policy, particularly under the Clinton administration, better. And I had a conversation before Richard Trumka, from the AFL, died with him about that. And I said, what were you being told at that time when we were thinking about how trade policy was going to work globally? And he said, he had a conversation with a then Clinton administration official who came to him and said, look, we know this is going to be hard for U.S. labor, but don't worry. Eventually things are going to level out, level up, level out, and wages are going to rise. And in the meantime, consumer prices are going to go down, and it's all going to be great. And he said, well, okay, but how long is that going to take? And the official said 3 to 5 generations. That is where we are now. That is where we are now. So first of all, it didn't work. And it didn't work because even before the latest bout of inflation, all the things that make us middle class, education, healthcare, housing, were rising at 3 times the core inflation rate, okay? And that is about the neoliberal economic policies, which were essentially about growing an asset economy rather than prioritizing competitiveness and income-based growth. Now, I think we made a big step forward in terms of changing that narrative during the Biden administration. I actually wrote about the executive order that came down in July 2021, in which Biden said, and it was totally underreported, I have to say, it's just amazing to me. He said, look, trickle down is over. Trickle down has not worked. We are in an era, a post, neoliberal era. Power matters. We have to think about the real economy, what's really happening, and not just economic theories. And so I think that vectorally, where the Biden administration has gone in the last 2 years is absolutely the right thing. But per Jake's comment, now comes implementation. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And I could go on, but I'll just say, I think the action is going to be in mapping supply chains. And mapping supply chains sounds pedestrian. In fact, it's going to be like pulling up the scrim on everything that corporations have been doing for the last 40 years that different parts of governments in different countries are trying to get at. Tax evasion, sanctions evasion, all different kinds of things that are happening that have skewed the capital-labor balance. We now have an opportunity to see what's happening and to work together to correct it. So I'm actually very optimistic about the next couple of years.
Thanks. Evan, if I can go to you. So, I mean, one of the things that came up multiple times from various angles was, is there an irresolvable tension between competition and the necessary cooperation? What did you think about Jake's response to that?
Well, I don't know if it's irresolvable, but it's definitely not, it's not easy. Because, I mean, what we heard from Jake, what we just heard from Rana, a lot of foreign policy increasingly is about domestic politics. And the United States is not the only one with domestic politics. Lots of other countries have domestic politics. So if you're organizing coalitions, because the object of your interest is to build a counter-China coalition, or at least to compete with China in partnership with other countries, then you're going to need to do it in a way that reflects their interests, their goals, their aspirations, and their domestic politics too. So I think that's part of what the administration has run into in the last few years, is they came in, I think very much they wanted to be more confrontational toward China, but also more multilateral. And in a number of instances, what they've found is they can't always have their cake and eat it. So they can be more unilateral and more confrontational, or they can be more multilateral, but they have to be less confrontational, because a lot of countries, particularly in Asia and particularly in the global south that are not OECD economies, just have a different problem set, and they touch the Chinese elephant in very different ways, because their goals and their agendas and their aspirations are around growth, employment, opportunity, upskilling, and in many cases, the Chinese offering is still very appealing. So if you want to go fight with China, particularly in large chunks of the world, Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, Africa, Latin America, what the United States is finding is that the mathematical operations that often matter for those countries are addition and multiplication rather than subtraction and division. And the perception, I think, in a lot of places is what the United States is asking is for subtraction and division. Now, this is not just a function of this administration. If you go back to the last one, I remember, Corey will remember this, I'm old enough to remember when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made a global tour in Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and he would land in countries like Uzbekistan, and he would say, don't take any of that Chinese money, essentially. You don't want their money. And for a country like Uzbekistan, that's not a winning message because, as I said, the name of the game is additive and multiplicative, but it's also just the case that China has the map in its favor, right? And it has economic gravity in some of those sectors in its favor. So when you step outside of the American context, and particularly the transatlantic context, competition with China has to mean more than just what it means in the American domestic context. And that's where I think any administration might have struggled. But I will say this, there's been I've worked on U.S.-China relations for, long time, 25 years, 30 years. It's been a total sea change where if you rewind the clock maybe 10 years, it was broadly a cooperative relationship with a heavy dose of competition. And now it essentially looks to me like a broadly confrontational relationship with a pretty heavy dose of what I would call adversarial antagonism. And so then the question is, how do you navigate in that in a way that controls for the scope, intensity, and pace of escalation, and Jake acknowledged this, but also leaves some scope for cooperation with China on some of the transnational and global issues that he raised too. And there, I think we haven't cracked the code, and it's not clear to me that any of the last several administrations have cracked the code.
So, Corey, if we can ask you, a piece of that is the competition, the confrontation, to kind of stick with the theme of understanding the domestic and the foreign together. Part of the challenge we face is and part of I think what we're talking about here today is trying to build or rebuild an actual durable consensus and a shared understanding of what the American foreign policy project is and how it connects to our domestic political project. And as I see it, one of the lessons of the last 20 years, the global war on terror, has been we have to be pretty careful about the way we frame up these challenges, the rhetoric we use, because it has clear negative impacts on our own politics. I think some, including my former boss, have raised concerns about the way we talk about China as a threat. I think the Biden administration has been pretty careful about that in a way that his predecessor, I think, was not. But what are some of the trends that you see? We have a Republican-controlled House coming in. They've made clear they're going to be focusing on China in its various aspects. What do you think the most productive way is for us to kind of think and talk about this, understanding the larger project of trying to forge this consensus?
So a couple of things. First, both political parties are missing a huge opportunity on trade. If you look at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs surveys of public attitudes, Americans have never been more pro-trade than they are now. And the Biden administration is genuinely anti-trade, right? What I heard the National Security Advisor say was, we're going to massively subsidize American businesses, despite saying we're not going to help corporations. We're going to massively subsidize American businesses, and that's going to be good for the world. And actually, allies don't think that. What America's friends in Asia and elsewhere are pleading for is an economic strategy that will help all of us reduce our reliance on China. They see the nature of the China threat. They do not want it characterized as an ideological crusade. They do not want it characterized as a major military confrontation. So the way we are telescoping everything about China down to the defense of Taiwan is something we're not going to be able to persuade others to align to. What they want is for us to rejoin what used to be called the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. They want us to explain not just how we're going to help our businesses dominate the world, how we're going to help their businesses dominate the world. So I think finding a bipartisan way to both get on a common front with America's allies about what we need to do together to manage China that's not overtly ideological and that's not overly militarized, I think is going to be a huge challenge. It's not at all clear to me that some parts of the Republican caucus in the House are going to be particularly productive on that. But there are also really positive signs. I think Republicans in the Senate have been incredibly disciplined and incredibly constructive in supporting Biden administration national security policy. I think Congress understands that the Biden administration, the National Security Advisor acted like it was a big surprise that the defense industrial base is underfunded. It's not a big surprise to anybody in the defense community, but the administration's budgets actually don't redress the problem. Congress just did with an additional $48 billion focused on procurement. So I think there are constructive places to go on this, but I think the ease with which we are talking about engaging the middle class might not be the same ways that we can build international coalitions on that.
Andrew, Jake talked a little bit about, he was asked and answered about the transatlantic relationship, and over the past few weeks we've seen some of these tensions arise over the IRA. Not just the IRA, but also, around the Ukraine war, not the justness of defending Ukraine, but also we've seen some reporting on, people raising eyebrows to American defense contractors benefiting from having to replenish these stocks over and over. As you look at the state of the Ukraine war and the Biden administration's response to it, not only the relationship with the U.S. and Europe, but, and again, I was struck by how Jake did bring up and stress the efforts that the Biden administration has made to relate to regions in the global South. He brought up the Summit of the Americas. He brought up, obviously, the Africa Summit this week and outreach to Southeast Asia. They're very, very conscious of that, and yet this is also an audience that Putin has tried to appeal to, as the Chinese government has had to. So how do you see that playing out?
Sure thing. And first of all, thanks for the very kind words at the beginning about the book. I heard Sullivan a couple times, indirectly and directly, say he doesn't know how long this is going to go and where it ends up. And it's important for people to remember that the administration, when it first heard about Russia's plans, has been crushed by the demands of the moment. How do we avoid the worst case outcome? How do you avoid spectacular Russian military success? How do you make Ukraine a porcupine that Russia can't swallow? Because that was what people were betting on. And now we've ended up in a world which is well past the worst case, where we have an open-ended land war between Russia and Ukraine, and we have no prospect of either side prevailing militarily. And we heard in the conversation with Jake Sullivan analogies to World War I being raised. And if Ukraine, just to cite the figures, is shooting off 90,000 artillery shells per month, and oftentimes the Russians are triple or quadruple that, we're looking at a campaign that is going to test our industrial base, because the U.S. can't produce the 155 millimeter artillery that we increasingly want Ukraine to rely. We're not going to hit the 40,000 level monthly production for that kind of ammunition until 2025. So there is this delta between what Ukraine needs right now and the longer term question of sustainment and how the U.S. can possibly keep this going as Ukraine exhausts the Russian capacity and its own capacity to in this brutal war. The problem I think the administration is going to face is the framing they've used of as long as it takes. What does that mean? And if that means a decade, if that means 5 years, if that means 3 years, as I think a lot of us fear may very well be the case, that is going to put all sorts of pressure on our economy. It's going to put pressure on our alliances. And it will not, as my colleague Eugene Rumer wrote in a paper that came out last week about Putin's long war, we're still facing the reality of a Vladimir Putin who intends to either conquer Ukraine and die trying or keep trying until he dies. And since the man's only 70 years old, that's a pretty scary prospect. And it really does, warp some of the goals Rana outlined, the goals that Corey outlined, and Evan as well, if this will just keep being the pincer movement that pushes U.S. foreign policy through, it's like, are we winning in Ukraine? If that's going to be the yardstick for U.S. foreign policy for the next 3 to 10 years, that's a very challenging framing.
So, just to stay with you for a minute, I think a lot of us were surprised at the speed with which the U.S. and its partners imposed a pretty heavy set of sanctions on Russia. What's your assessment of the impact of that? And I think one could look at this and say, it's not impacting Putin's behavior. I think it's imposing costs or hurting his ability to get certain equipment for the war effort. But you said he seems committed to go ahead until he wins or dies. Do these sanctions make much of a difference to him and his behavior?
Sanctions are a tool and a way of demonstrating that there'll be a penalty, but they are not by themselves the formula for ending the war. And we've in the past, overdone it with sanctions because we've treated them as this magic weapon, but sanctions are part of a broader strategy, and they take a long time to impact leaders' decisions. Vladimir Putin will win this war or fight this war regardless, in his mind, of whether or not Russians can go vacation in the south of France. Like, that is a tertiary consideration for him. What the weapons Russia uses are maybe not going to be the elegant, sophisticated weapons we use, but they are, as we see every day with this brutal campaign against Ukraine's critical infrastructure, they're doing the job. Russia has knocked out more than half of Ukraine's civilian power generation capacity. This is not dependent on having access to advanced semiconductors. This is just a question of, pounding the heck out of Ukraine in the way Russia won Soviet Union triumphed in World War II. And if Vladimir Putin is determined to make Ukraine unlivable and sees that as a logical way to put pressure on the Europeans, seeing them as part of the weak link in U.S. strategy, that's the road we're on. So right now, I assume everyone's seen it, Ukraine looks increasingly challenged to get through the winter. The French president convened a meeting in Paris on Tuesday about winterizing Ukraine. We have a country that's pre-war population was 40 million. Winterizing a whole country with no power, with no drinking water, no heat, that's a massive undertaking that's frankly beyond our capacity. So that means people are going to have to leave. There'll be a new wave of refugees. And we're seeing the welcome mat for those refugees being rolled up in various parts of Europe. That's a different war and a different set of considerations than the ones that we all sort of took for granted back in the March-April timeframe, where it was kind of like, we'll all, tighten our belts, we'll all do things to help Ukraine. I don't have any doubt that the U.S. president is going to stick this out, but I do think there's a lot of squishiness in the transatlantic community about whose economy is going to suffer, how's this pain going to be distributed, who's going to pay for it. And then we see other institutions that have boundless capacity, like the International Monetary Fund, that have not stepped up at all. And so if Ukraine's economy is looking at, if in the worst case, 50% hit to its GDP, if this Russian campaign against the civil infrastructure continues just in the coming weeks, the IMF has a kind of like view that we don't lend in war zones, and that's got to change.
Yeah, if we could just stay with Ukraine for a minute. One of the questions that I've gotten a lot, I'm sure everyone on this panel has fielded questions or asked them in the case of our journalists, the impacts of the midterms on U.S. foreign policy, but specifically on Ukraine is one that I've gotten repeatedly. We've seen, comments from Kevin McCarthy and others, raising questions about continuing to support, which again, in my view, is an entirely appropriate question for a member of Congress or a congressional leader to ask. Oversight is a huge part of Congress's job, and yet it has made some people nervous about, the staying power of U.S. support. Do you think there's reason for concern, Corey?
I do think there's reason for concern, but I think it's manageable because I think there's widespread bipartisan support for continuing to assist Ukraine, and the limits on our current ability to provide weapons to them. It's not the law of gravity, it's not laws of physics, it's money and contracts that can actually change that. And so we could be providing more support and should be providing more support. Where I think Republicans in Congress have concerns are in two areas. First, there is a misapprehension among Republican members of Congress that there's a lack of oversight over the aid that's being given, when in fact the inspectors general of both the Department of State and the Department of Defense are doing a very careful job of ensuring that. So the administration needs to do a better job of educating Congress that oversight is being practiced effectively already. And the second thing is, I think there are, patriotic budget hawks in Congress who want an explanation of where the enormous assistance we are providing to Ukraine fits in our broader national security priorities. And as Andrew rightly raised, are we going to do this for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Is there a better, more cost-effective, more humane strategy we could be carrying out than slowly increasing the support, the weapons support that we give to Ukraine as the civilian infrastructure and the civilian population continues to be terrorized by Russia? And as you said, Matt, I think those are legitimate questions to ask, but I also think there are good answers to both of those questions that sustain support for Ukraine.
If I could just turn to some of what Jake said about, pandemic and vaccines. I was struck by the point he made about not wanting to just provide vaccines, but also support increased manufacturing capacity around vaccines, but also therapeutics. And here I thought of, a lot of the work that was done around the TRIPS waiver at the WTO, which was something that was initially proposed, I think it was November of 2020 by South Africa and India. There was a pretty strong kind of global activist push for that, including some in Congress, and the administration came out in support of this waiver in May 2021, and yet it has stalled since then. There's been a little bit of movement. There was a draft kind of compromise agreement that did actually nothing of what activists wanted, and yet that was precisely the goal of this proposal, was to increase capacity around vaccines, generics, and therapeutics. Rana, what do you think about how they've managed this question?
So this is all really interesting. I'm going to pull the lens way back, and I'm going to try and connect some of the dots that I think we're speaking about different topics in silos. I actually think the TRIPS waiver, aid to Ukraine, the transatlantic alliance, and policy towards China actually are connected, and that there is a solution. So let me go back. Corporate interests in both the U.S., in the pharmaceutical industry, but more particularly in the German pharmaceutical industry, are the reason that we didn't get more action on the TRIPS waiver.
What?
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Hello, we have to talk about corporate power here. And I think that we actually need to have a narrative that takes into the fact that our assumptions about how the economy works and the assumptions of the institutions, the WTO in this case, that are governing that they're not working the way they're supposed to. We have to have that conversation. Why are these institutions not working generally for the benefit of people who need vaccines or working people? Because the neoliberal economic assumptions were wrong. The assumptions that the whole Washington Consensus was based on is that capital, goods, and people can all travel equally as well as they want to go to wherever it's most productive. Capital traveled faster, goods a little bit, people not at all. These are the kind of fundamental economic questions that we're grappling with. But within that, there's a lot of common ground. And I'm going to speak in economic terms, but I think it's really important right now, because I often find when I'm in these conversations about statecraft, it can get really linear and siloed. I think that we need to step back and say we're at a turning point where the old model is broken. The recipe for shared productive growth is when the public sector underwrites a transformative new technology. That, in economic history, that's always what happens. The railroads, DARPA and the internet. You get the public sector to put a floor under something, and then the private sector commercializes it. That's where we are now. That's the common ground in the transatlantic alliance. And that's why coming together with an industrial strategy around the clean transition and strategic sectors around that, I would throw semis into that, is the conversation that needs to happen right now. Europe is freaked out because they don't, particularly small countries, I'm in Britain, I work for a British newspaper, we have this conversation all the time. They're worried. We don't live in a region with food, fuel, consumer demand. China can kind of go make this work. The U.S. can make this work. How are we going to make this work? If we can have that conversation and say, actually, we do need to create shared demand. We need an industrial strategy that's going to incorporate the Dutch in the semiconductor plan, the Germans, the British. the French. Let's have that conversation. Let's map it out. And I suspect that some of these other issues would start to fall into line a lot more easily than when we have the more siloed conversation. I know that's a little high level, but I think that's where we need to be.
Thank you. Evan, take it.
Take it.
I can tell.
Wow,
I can tell you wanted to respond.
No. That's well, I'm glad you talked about the tech. I mean, most of my time is on U.S.-China, or on China, and the tech. We were talking. Ron and I were talking before. It was interesting. Jake Sullivan went straight to the tech stuff when he was talking to you, Tino, about U.S.-China, and it's not surprising. I think a lot of it has to do with the intensity of the competition, but also, frankly, that the nature of the technology has changed. And you were kind of implying this when you got at the idea of transformative technology. So I've said this before, there was a period in history where a lot of the transformative commercial technologies actually came out of weapons innovation, particularly in the period after World War II.
Public sector defense.
Yeah. So you
always the way
you had American computing, you had British radar, you had German rocketry, and there was a lot of commercial innovation that happened as a result of that. After, since you mentioned semiconductors, the microelectronics revolution, that flow really reversed. But Corey spends a lot of time on defense. A lot of the transformative defense technologies are intrinsically dual use, multiple use. So part of why I think technology is now front and center on the U.S.-China stuff and on American economic statecraft generally is because the technologies that are supposedly emerging and foundational, new synthetic and composite materials, nanotechnology, quantum computing, AI-enabled applications, large data algorithms, all of these things are intrinsically multiple use. So they have these wondrous commercial and public-spirited applications, but they're also very transformative for defense. And if that's the case, and if China, like the United States, is trying to get their hands on these things, then inevitably the entire economic conversation becomes securitized. The technology piece becomes securitized, the flow of capital, of people, of technology, of data, all of it is refracted through a national security prism. So that then bleeds into not just the U.S.-China competition, because you want to attenuate, as the U.S. government has tried with administrative and regulatory instruments, the flow of some of this stuff to China, but you want other people to attenuate it too. And so when you mention the Dutch, you're talking about ASML, what the U.S. is essentially trying to do now is get everybody to either adopt some version of American regulatory and administrative policy toward China, or to comply with it voluntarily. And if they won't comply with it voluntarily, to bring the hammer down and try to organize these coalitions coercively. And so that's where we get into the statecraft challenge, because it is not clear to me, notwithstanding what you said, that all of the allies and partners the U.S. is going to need on this are positioned where the U.S. wants them positioned, nor will there not be a lot of scratchiness. So a little scratchiness with the Dutch a couple of weeks ago, but the Dutch are an easier case.
Yeah.
And I just feel like once the low-hanging fruit, which is export controls and investment screening, gets picked, what's going to happen is it's just going to be a lot harder for the U.S. to persuade countries, companies, market participants
Totally
around
disagree.
the world. Really?
Totally
you think
disagree.
It's gonna be easy? No
I
scratching?
think it's going to be easier, and here's why.
Okay.
I think that we are coming at this from a top-down approach. We are about to, in the next 2 years, there are a number of companies and agencies, but companies actually are ahead in mapping truly what is happening in these supply chains. Once that information is in the public sphere, you're going to start to really see where the linkages are, and they're going to be scary, because it is not at all uncommon to find completely overlapping, a company based in Texas that's doing business for the federal government that works with a Dutch subsidiary that also is building something for the PLA. I mean, these things are just deeper and more complex than you can imagine. And we can start, once we see that data, having the conversation in a much more granular way. And I think that's actually going to make it easier. I mean, transparency really does matter. Right now, this is a very vague conversation about politics. Once it becomes an actual, literal conversation about who is doing what that is actually breaking the law, it's going to get a lot more interesting.
But whose law? I mean, if you're a Taiwanese company,
Well,
why do you necessarily see it the way the U.S. government does?
U.S. sanction law, EU. I mean, I think the
precisely.
Germans are
So
going
that's
to.
what
The
I said. So
Germans
you
are going to
offshore
have
your-
to. No, the Germans are going to have to make some tough decisions. The American government is going to have to make some tough decisions about its own tech leaders, you know? I mean, this is where the rubber, and this is the post-neoliberal era. It's not, we're spending a lot of time bickering between countries. It's about companies v. countries, I believe.
But I don't think we're disagreeing. I mean, Corey was nodding at me because I think we agree. The U.S. is determined to attenuate the flow of some of this stuff to potential adversaries or actual adversaries. Therefore, it is using administrative and regulatory instruments that were always in the arsenal. And in many cases, it's having to extraterritorialize the application of them. Now, that may be easy with some countries and some companies. But my theory of the case would be it will not be easy with all companies and all countries. And every time I talk to Taiwanese firms or I talk to Korean firms, they say to me things like, well, you know, we have politics too. Guess what? We have corporate interests too.
Sure.
And so that's, I don't mean that it isn't in the interest of the U.S. government to pursue those things. I'm just saying there's going to be a lot more scratchiness to it, including among the democracies and including among the very countries that the United States is trying to organize in pursuit of its geostrategic aims with China. And if people don't think that's the case, then my advice is to spend more time hanging out in Taiwan, because I think that it's already becoming scratchy there where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess by scratchy, I think it's just going to be easier to make decisions once the information is more transparent. I mean, it might be hard, but it's going to, people are going to, you know, see what's what. Right now, we're having these conversations.
I think the German case might be illustrative in this regard, right? Like, Germany now has religion about their exposure to Russia, but they are profoundly uninterested in carrying out that exercise with regard to China.
100%.
And it's not a mystery that Volkswagen and BASF and others are deeply engaged in China. So how is that information, I mean, the information's already in the public realm, but the German government and German companies looking at the loss of Russian opportunities are actually going to put up a terrible fight where the China piece comes.
Well, what I would like to see is the administration saying, you know, Germans, when you're complaining about not being included in subsidies in the IRA, get over yourselves. Stop, have BASF build a factory here, put down your tariffs so that they're not 2.4, 2.5 times as much as the U.S. tariffs into Germany or into the U.S. in the auto industry are. I mean, you can start to have these very literal conversations. There are some, things to be horse traded here. Let's get them horse traded.
If I could turn.
This is all just like, at some point the rubber has to meet the road. I feel like I've been in these conversations for 10 years, I'm sorry.
No, please
I'm
don't.
blowing up the Carnegie Institute here.
I love it. I'm sorry to cut it off. I mean, just because I wanted to cover a few other subjects. I mean, one of them, again, the whole, the premise of these conversations going on today is let's, take a look at some of the goals and aspirations that, the Biden administration set for themselves, in light of the last 2 years. I mean, one of those things was, President Biden spent a lot of time and still does talk a lot about American values, human rights, elevating human rights. Elevating human rights as a key part of the American foreign policy agenda, and yet I think it's pretty clear that in many regions, particularly the Middle East, they have taken what I would say is a very hard realpolitik approach. And Corey, you served in the Bush administration. I had some pretty serious disagreements with a lot of things George W. Bush did, but one thing I strongly agreed with him on was his, assessment post 9/11 that the United States had made a bad investment in authoritarian regimes in that region. That we had, in return for a promise of security and stability, we had supported a number of, deeply repressive regimes who effectively imprisoned their own people, and that we were not going to do that anymore. And yet, here we are now. And I see, President Biden made a lot of promises about changing the relationship with Saudi Arabia. We don't have to revisit the fist bump, but we've seen an approach to that region which has really not reflected those comments that he made. And I think, they have some not illegitimate reasons for why they did that. One of the foremost of which would be Ukraine. They'll say that Ukraine changed everything. And, Jake laid out, a kind of, balance sheet of liabilities versus assets. We want to shed the former and increase the latter, and I think they see these relationships with a lot of these governments, particularly Saudi Arabia, as continuing assets. There are costs to that. I would argue with that classification.
Yeah, I agree with your judgment on that, Matt. This morning there are pictures all over the place of President Biden joyfully embracing the autocratic leader of Egypt. And what they are managing to do is have make grandiose claims about the centrality of human rights, and that damages relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, but then not be able to get the benefit of better relationships. So we have the worst combination of declaratory policies that aren't producing, that we don't carry out, and that do produce bad outcomes with allies. It's a mystery to me, actually, that Saudi, two things about the Middle East in particular. I'm sorry, I'm going hoarse. Two things. One is that I think the Trump administration's strategy for writing off the Middle East was the Abraham Accords, right? To partner Israel and the countries of the Gulf to balance Iran and pull together the Arab world. And that deal was made to the detriment of Palestinians. And but it was a hard-headed realpolitik deal that we don't want to care about the region, and we want our friends in the region to be strong enough to take care of themselves. It's not clear to me at all what the Biden administration's strategy for the Middle East is. They also don't want to care about the Middle East, and yet we're on our second or third reconsideration of relations with Saudi Arabia, and they're managing to please nobody. They're not pleasing the Saudi government. They're not propagating American values. So I think it actually is one of the real, in the assets versus liabilities, the approach they are taking to the Middle East is a major liability, not just in the relationships that produce low gas prices, but in the relationships that produce a resurgence of ISIS and other bad things in the region.
Right. I mean, I would agree with your take on Abraham Accords. And I would only just add it's not at the expense of the Palestinians. It's the expense of the mass of the population of Egypt and the Emirates and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. And yet it's justified in terms of, global competition. We need more partners. We don't want to move people from the partner column to the enemy column needlessly. But it does seem to me that this is something that can be used to justify a whole set of policies and partnerships that we might see as problematic.
If I may add one more thing, it is not true that repressive regimes are a force for stability. They are so much more brittle than the so-called hard-headed policy of embracing dictatorships makes them seem. It's actually a bad short-term bet as well as a bad long-term bet.
Andrew, I mean, one of the, there's, the concerns about China's increasing presence in the Middle East, but also Russia, going back to Russia's entree into Syria. I mean, given the cost that Russia has borne and Putin has borne in Ukraine, what's your take on how, Putin might see his role in the Middle East from now?
Russians have their hands full, and the war is, immense drain. The war is an immense drain on bandwidth for the Russian government and its resources. Russians are magicians, though, at making puny initiatives look massive. They're also not a newcomer to the Middle East, and we took for granted the period when Russia was absent after the Soviet collapse and after the Gorbachev era, and sort of thought that was the normal. And Russia's been a big player in the Middle East going back centuries. So the fact that they're there and the fact that they've saved the Assad regime and showed that they can act audaciously and use military force to boot makes them a player. And at a time when the U.S. is perceived by many of the leading powers, the region is backing away, it's not a surprise that some countries want to hedge. I think the challenge for U.S. policy, and we saw this tension during President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, is we can't command our partners and allies not to hedge and not to play with China and Russia if they're worried about our staying power. And it just, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but all these dilemmas that you were talking about, Corey was talking about what's the purpose of U.S. power, what is our alliance, what's our presence going to entail, what are the commitments we're prepared to make, how much of this are we prepared to do again based on the record of failure in the Middle East over the last couple decades. All of those questions are swirling around in the minds of our partners. They're also swirling around in the minds of our adversaries. And the Russians are opportunists. And so if they see a way to make nice with Saudi Arabia, and the Russians did this after the war in Ukraine started in 2014 to shore up oil prices, you can bet they're going to do it. And we're now facing a really significant Saudi-Russian tandem that's predicated on the benefit both countries extract from having relatively high oil prices. And there ain't a lot the U.S. can do about it, short of making those dramatic innovations in the energy transition that Jake spoke about this morning. In the meantime, we can kind of complain mightily about how they're squeezing consumers or how that's bad for climate impacts. But the action and the imperative really falls on us in the end.
We've talked a lot about, climate and pandemics, but if I can just turn to a kind of a more old-timey concern, nuclear non-proliferation. One of the Biden administration's early successes was extending New START, but obviously U.S.-Russia talks have gotten very, very cold since then. We've seen China expanding its own nuclear arsenal. I mean, what's the possibility of moving forward on the still very, very necessary work of nuclear non-proliferation? We've seen, the Iran deal basically just sitting on the table understandably amid the protests we've seen there. I think their position on stepping back from that makes sense, but still a really important agreement in its own right. And leaving aside even nuclear, what is the possibility of getting some kind of international kind of set of agreements around cyber weapons, whose very value is in their deniability? I mean, what does an actual cyber weapons non-proliferation regime look like?
So I share your view, Matt, that the administration was right to step back from negotiations with Iran, given the protests and the repressiveness of the government there. But we still have the problem of Iran's progress towards being a nuclear weapon state. And sustaining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think, is hugely consequential. We are beneficiaries of it. Others are beneficiaries of it. I wish the president would stop publicly wringing his hands about World War III and nuclear escalation over Ukraine, because I think that reinforces the value of having nuclear weapons. It would be, I think, a more non-proliferation friendly approach for the president and others to say, it doesn't matter what weapons get used, because we are going to continue to assist Ukraine to victory, irrespective. That's what Ukrainians are saying, and that I think it advances non-proliferation for us to focus less on the weapons and more on the outcomes. I also think there may be arms control opportunities that it's in American interest to take with the Russians. As awful as the Russians are, as terrible as what they're doing in Ukraine, for reasons that others have already mentioned, the pressure of this war continuing another 6 months, and the burdens that Europeans and Ukrainians are bearing as the war goes on. Seems to me those of us who are strengthened by the outcome of this war and who are living in safety ought to be thinking more creatively about, are there ways we can make compromises with respect to Russia? So instead of pressing Ukraine to make concessions to end the war, are there things we can engage with the Russians that make their defeat in Ukraine less humiliating, easier for them to bear? And it seems to me one possibility is, given that Russia's army has just demonstrated its improficiency, and the strength of Western militaries, perhaps returning to CFE negotiations, limits on conventional forces in Europe. It'd certainly be in Russia's interest to try and restrain the strength of Western militaries, and maybe we can give some interest in that as opposed to pressing the Ukrainians to make compromises.
Evan, if I can go back to China for a second. I mean, we've talked a lot about, inequality in the international economic system. To what extent is inequality within China a factor in the Chinese government's behavior? And what are some of the steps the Biden administration has taken over the past few months, some of them pretty aggressive, that could impact the Chinese economy? What kind of effects do you think that'll have on Chinese ability or willingness to engage?
Well, I mean, we're sitting in Washington, so when anybody talks about China, it's always U.S. China, it's China in the world, it's the Belt and Road. But I think the reality is if you're the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and you wake up in the morning, whether you get out of bed on the left side or the right side, the first probably 5 things you think about in the morning are all domestic. So the first is how to keep the Communist Party in power. The second is how to create 11 to 12 million jobs a year. And there's pressure at both ends of the labor market in China, the low end from migrants, and at the high end from white-collar graduates where there are less jobs. Third is how to grow the economy at a requisite percentage so that you can create those kinds of jobs, but also how you can move toward where the Chinese have wanted to go since the mid-2000s, which is basically a slower growth, higher inflation, but higher quality growth world. Then fourth, they've got a huge demographic time bomb on their hands because they're getting old before they're really getting rich. And they've fixed urban enterprise pensions, but the pension system still has some gaps in it. And then, of course, the growth model, which they've been talking about for 15 years, is energy intensive, but energy inefficient and extremely environmentally unfriendly. And so if you're thinking for the long term and you're the leader of China, that's basically what's on your mind first. And I think the problem they have, and it's not really, Matt, just about inequality, it's about the way I would characterize it is how to build a functioning social contract that meets those Communist Party goals, but also delivers higher quality governance to Chinese people. They're pretty good diagnosticians about what the problems are, but they don't have the answers on a lot of that. So the way I sometimes characterize it is that the basic social contract in China that has prevailed for the last few decades has eroded completely. And that contract was, to oversimplify it, people would stay out of organized politics. And in exchange, they would have huge opportunities for material gain that their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents could never have known. And that was fine right up until you had 450, 500 million people that achieved material things. And so for those people, and especially for urban middle-class people in China, their expectations and demands increasingly transcend things that are merely material. They want equity of life chances. It's a different way of thinking about inequality. They want food that's safe to eat. They want air that they can breathe, water they can drink. So these non-material aspects, not just of growth, but of quality of life, that actually has been very central to Xi Jinping's agenda since he came to power. So he calls his response to that common prosperity, which is sometimes mischaracterized, I think, as straight up redistribution. It's not redistribution in the sense of making all rich people poor, but it is about changing the contract between the state, private business, and people in a way that's designed to showcase that the state is delivering on these not purely material things, and also building a social contract that is more sustainable politically for the Communist Party, but also delivers higher quality governance. And so then the question becomes, how are they doing on that? And I think most people's view is that's a pretty mixed bag, actually. And it's not just because the economy has acute issues, there's property problem, they have to do some property workouts. It's because fundamentally they haven't figured out how to deliver clean, responsive governance in the context of the Leninist political system that they have. And Xi Jinping, I sometimes say I'm not a Chinese communist, but if I was one, I'd be trying to figure out how to make that work. He's trying to make that work for him, but they haven't cracked the code yet. But I think that's a broader way of thinking about inequality than just raising incomes, because their response to your question, if Mr. Xi were sitting here, he'd say, oh, yeah, we're doing great. Look how many people we've lifted out of poverty. That's all fine, but that's not what it's fundamentally about when you think about the challenge to the social contract now. It's not just about material gains and income in a pocket anymore. And there, I think they're still falling short.
I agree with much of what you just said. There's another interesting piece of this too, which plays into the decoupling question. You know, China 2025, which was pre-Trump, pre-Biden, obviously, is actually about regionalization, which is also an important part of their development path, because being dual circulation, allowing production and consumption, and faster iteration of an entire supply chain, that's kind of, I have an engineering dad, I grew up in factories, that's manufacturing innovation 101, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing for China. And more regionalization and redundancy is also a good thing for the world. I mean, frankly, it was a stupid idea for the entire world to ever have 92% of all high-end semiconductors in Taiwan. That's just absurd. That's like classic neoliberal economic mistake. It would be an interesting point, and I don't know kind of how you would do this from a statecraft perspective, but economically, regionalizing the world supply chains and increasing capacity and redundancy, be it in China and the One Belt, One Road, be it in Europe, be it in the U.S., this is actually a good thing economically and from a security standpoint. We need more semiconductor production. The Chinese need to move up the economic food chain by iterating more closely at higher levels. So, if you just look at it in pure economic terms, that's vectorally a good thing for the world, I think.
So I just want to remind folks to use the QR codes if you want to contribute questions. I'm trying to work some of these into our conversation up here. I want to turn to, I mentioned earlier, and Jake made a point to mention the work that the administration has done to reach out and engage with countries in the global south. But I want to focus on South America here. We've seen a really interesting wave of kind of left-leaning governments over the past few months in Chile and in Colombia, and most recently in Brazil with the re-election of Lula. And I am really struck by the difference in response we saw from the Biden administration, even from the Obama administration. There was a very quick call between, President Biden himself recognized Lula's victory quickly, followed shortly within 24 hours by a phone call. We saw multiple visits in the lead up to that election because of concerns. Bolsonaro's, the comments he'd made, preparing his own kind of stop this steal. But it's, if we're talking about thinking through a new global economic model, Rana, South America is where a lot of these early neoliberal experiments were first tried to pretty negative effect on the populations and in the struggling democracies in some of these countries. And it seems to me that if we are going to try and make that right, not just in terms of thinking about a new global economic model, but in also reaching out to these governments that have made some really serious promises and commitments to their own people that I think are entirely consistent with what President Biden has talked about in terms of strengthening democracy against the forces of autocracy and authoritarianism. It seems that this is a particular region where the United States not only kind of has an historical debt, but an opportunity to help think through what a more responsive economic system looks like for its people.
Yeah. No, and I could see, again, I'm going to come at it from the economic standpoint. I could see, a regional industrial strategy that would incorporate some of those countries. I mean, basically what's being done right now around, say, clean tech and batteries with Canada, U.S., Mexico, you could imagine that starting to encompass parts of Latin America. To me, this is very, very natural. It works from an economic standpoint because the IP and the manufacturing is all there. I think that would be a way to start to, build a kind of a fairer post-neoliberal economic paradigm. Again, I'm not a statecraft person. I don't know how you, do that conversation, but economically, that kind of regionalization works well, I think.
We have a question here about the protests in Iran. We talked a little bit about that, or Corey, you talked about that a bit, but I want to kind of draw it out a bit and look at, kind of protest movements or human rights movements elsewhere around the world. Like, what is the appropriate role of the United States? I mean, what tools can we use effectively? Is it just the president offering support? Is it offering kind of internet access, other tools for these movements to communicate, because there is a line, and I think sometimes we've gotten it right and sometimes wrong, of, do we delegitimize protests, or do we enable repressive governments to delegitimize protesters because of being too explicit and forward in our support? I mean, this is a question we can talk about with Russia, with China. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a genuinely difficult challenge because on the one hand, you do want to provide moral, I think we should always provide moral support to people who are struggling against repression. I think that's natural for Americans as an outgrowth of our own political culture. In countries like Iran, we have to be careful because the government is claiming that the protests are being fostered and fomented by the United States, and we don't want to put protesters in greater danger. I do think there's been a lot of interesting work, including by companies like Google and Microsoft, and even Starlink in the Ukraine example, about how to help protesters or governments that are struggling to continue to have access and to be able to communicate clandestinely without government supervision. But the flip side of that is we actually don't want terrorists to be able to do that. So there's not an easy answer to it, but I do think the administration has been doing a good job of hitting that balance. Andrew, I'd love to hear your answer to this on Russia.
So I am worried that we have now decided, maybe not even really having thought it all the way through, that there's no point in pushing wedges between the regime and Putin's government because it's hopeless. And I accept there's tons of resilience and tons of intimidating power that the Kremlin has marshaled over 20 plus years to make the Russian people more atomized, more passive, and more risk averse. But the strategy that we've adopted is let's basically put a huge barrier between migration of people out of Russia and frontline countries which feel very vulnerable, and Europe more broadly. And let's obviously prioritize the needs of Ukrainians who have been pushed out of their country by the war. And that, is paramount, given that those people are fleeing for safety. But right now, at least I'm old enough to remember, to use that line, 1989, the way the East German system fell is because we facilitated the movement of people. And when hundreds of thousands of East Germans decided to make a run for it, we helped them. And now when Russians are trying to make a break for it, we are saying, sorry, go back to your country and make revolution. And until you do that, we can't be very helpful. That's the sort of crude reality of the moment. On top of that, there is, I think, an effort underway that's understandable in the heat of the moment to deplatform Russia as much as possible. And the people who are being deplatformed, we kind of don't care so much about because we just want to send the message to the Kremlin that there's a huge, international chorus of condemnation for your criminality in Ukraine. But we surely have to find ways to segment and differentiate between the moves we take to deny Russia advanced technology and the benefits of the digital century that we live in, and the benefits that all of those tools provided average citizens to have access to information, to be part of the global information universe, and to organize themselves. And we've now managed to basically lop off most of those tools in the name of showing Russia that we are going to put this wall up around you. And as Matt alluded to at the beginning, a lot of this was done in the name of having the most unprecedented possible economic coercion through an unprecedented sanctions package. But we haven't really thought through, well, what are the digital tools that we want Russian citizens to retain access to? And as well, how do we find ways to sort of separate them from the regime? We've really done everything we can, I think, not really by design, but just by happenstance, to kind of make Russians feel that the world's against them as opposed to against the criminal regime in the Kremlin.
No, I think I'm glad you brought up the sanctions point, because I think we've seen the same problem in other countries like Iran and elsewhere. Is such a tight sanctions regime also prevents good things from getting through, not just technology that could help these movements, but also remittances from the diaspora that could help family members who are engaged.
And in the Iran case, the sanctions have facilitated the ascent to power of the militia and Basji and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, because they get preferential access.
Right. Again, a dynamic we've seen elsewhere, like in Venezuela. It tends to consolidate some of the worst aspects of the regime. I mean, we could have, and I hope we will have, an entire event to talk about sanctions reform, but I appreciate that. We're coming to the end here, so I just want to take a minute and thank you all very much for the conversation. Tino, thank you for doing this event, your great conversation with Jake. Thank you all for being here and for your great questions. It was a real privilege. Thank you.